Wrong day, but I saw the food, so I knew that if the food is here, people will come. So glad to be here. It's a particular pleasure for me to welcome Marsha to the Hope Horn Gallery tonight, as I stand here to recall with some nostalgia my acquaintance with her, and also with Hope Horn, with whom I studied sculpture many years ago, which convinced me that my passion for art was in appreciating it and not producing it, and with Berenice Dvorzan, whose amazing works surround us in the gallery, who became a close friend when she taught at Wilkes College. Marsha and I worked in adjacent cubicles, as I remember, at the National Endowment for the Humanities during my sojourn there in the early 1990s. So I've followed her amazing career since then, and have had occasional meetings from then until now, but never in Scranton. Marsha was and continues to be at the cutting edge of museum work. She's been most recently the director of the Office of Strategic Partnerships at the Institute of Museum and Library Services. She understands both the challenges and promise of museums in the cultural life of this nation. She knows that learning doesn't happen only in the classroom, and that the museum experience can be that spark of awareness that leads to creativity and innovation. It should be considered an integral part of the education of children and youth. One challenge is to keep museums open and vital in times of economic scarcity. We need them to open the eyes and minds and hearts of people young and old in our communities. The promise is endless as long as museums are there and are responsive to the needs of the 20th century's unprecedented access to knowledge and experience. Who might be more interested in their Facebook friends than in the face-to-face encounter with art and other important collections of historical and scientific value? Marsha recognizes that the sparks of learning that fuel curiosity, creativity, and innovation are often ignited in museums. So please welcome her to the podium.
Thank you. Thank you, Sandra. Thank you very much. Well, this isn't going to be as much of a lecture, I hope, as a discussion, because I don't have the answers. But what I thought I would do with my time here would be to just ask some questions. And the hard part is, several months ago when I was in communication with Sandra and Darlene about this talk, Darlene needed a title. So, I had no idea what I was going to talk about. I did some reading up on Berenice Dvorzan, and what really interested me about her work was the boundaries that she crosses in her work. Her not only incredible artistry, but her passion about the environment and how that links to her own spiritual life. So I just started to think about her exploration of different territories and territories that cross into different spheres and different disciplines. So that's how I came up with this title. And then, when I realized I'd have to talk about it, I was like, okay, what do I say? So that was my, let's see. Next. I don't know, Darlene, maybe I'm. So this is a terribly blurry map, so I'm going to talk about maps. And I thought that since this is where we are, and I just had my first little tour of the campus, walking over here from the hotel, the Radisson Hotel. This is a map of the campus, and I'm going to show you a couple of other maps because we are here in a physical place, in a physical campus, in a physical community. What I want to explore with you is what that notion of community is when we think about the world that we're in today. So what I'm going to explore is a different map, which is the map of learning. Lifelong learning, life-wide learning, and life-deep learning from cradle to grave. And hope that we can imagine together what roles museums currently play in that map and what roles they might need to think about playing as the world of learning is going through such incredibly dynamic change. So I want to learn something about you. How many of you are students here? Great. How many of you are museum people? Right. How many of you are on the faculty here? Great. Who didn't raise their hand? Okay, what do I need to know about you?
Librarian.
Librarian, okay. Okay, anybody? All right, well, so we've got people here representing a number of different communities and worlds here. And what I thought I would do before we get into the maps that I want to talk with you about is tell you a little bit about me. And this is, who did this painting? Anybody know? It's Turner. Yeah, it's a Turner painting. So I am from Detroit. I went to high school in downtown Detroit. I went to a school that had 5,000 students. And when I think about my journey, because believe me, I didn't start off thinking that my world was going to be about museums or anything like that. I had no clue. But I was a child of the 60s, right? So at Cass, we did a senior trip by train to New York City from Detroit. And one of the afternoons, we were scheduled to go to the Radio City Music Hall and see Debbie Reynolds in The Singing Nun. Well, my friend Sandy Cohen and I said, we are not going to do that. And we decided instead to go to the Museum of Modern Art, which was showing an exhibition, a great retrospective exhibition of Turner. So not only were we dazzled by the golden landscapes of Turner, but in one of the galleries we found our own American history teacher, whose name was Mr. Stevens, also skipping out on the film. He was a chaperone. He was supposed to be with us at the Radio City Music Hall, who was in his own right charismatic, inspiring, and dazzling, just like the Turners. So although there are probably many other reasons why I ended up studying art history and getting jobs in museums and all of that. That combination of a great museum experience, learning something about art, the cognitive experience about learning something about art, being with my best friend Sandy Cowan, and being in the presence of that hunk, Larry Stevens, who only used primary sources. He never believed in textbooks, and he was just gorgeous. And in fact, he retired from teaching and opened up his own art gallery a couple of years later. Somehow that was a real epiphany for me as I kind of do a new narrative of my life and career. And it shows something about the role of museums, right? So I'm not going to take you on a long march through the next 40 years of my career, so relax. But I do want to say something about my last gig, which was at the Institute of Museum and Library Services, which is one of 3 major federal cultural agencies. And I just left IMLS in June, and I was telling Sandra that if I hadn't retired from federal service in June, I wouldn't be here tonight because I wouldn't have been allowed to travel or do anything official for the government. So I'm kind of happy that I'm not in that place right now. But my job as the first director of strategic partnerships at IMLS involved making connections, and making connections between museums and libraries, and making connections between our agency and other federal agencies like the Humanities Endowment and the Department of Education and the FCC, and making connections also between our agency and other organizations, other nonprofit organizations. And the key to the job was, what is it that museums and libraries know and do well that connects to larger issues and concerns out there beyond museum and library land? And so I like to think about myself as a kind of bumblebee. I would pollinate, I would say, oh, museums and libraries do X, and you need Y, and I would go back and forth. So, for example, the Partnership for a Nation of Learners was a project that we did with the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And the premise of that partnership was that museums and libraries and public broadcasting are, to quote one of my mentors, the public utilities of the knowledge society. We all were about content, we were all about connection, we were all about lifelong learning. Why don't we work together for a change So we did a funding program where a museum, a library, and a public broadcasting station would come together and develop a project that would serve the needs of its community. In some ways, the projects were really amazing, but in some ways, the most valuable part of that partnership, as is true for many partnerships, was bringing people around shared tables who had never talked to each other before, and finding out what we had in common, and thinking about aligning our resources to make a bigger difference. One of our projects was with the Boston Children's Museum and WGBH and the Boston Hospital Center and the Boston Public Library, and it was about preventing asthma prevention strategies for children. So the Boston Children's Museum did some exhibits. The library had some resources and some programs for families. And GBH did, I think GBH, a lot of what they did was use Arthur, you know, the cartoon character Arthur around it. But again, it was, a lot of this work was about what is a big issue out there that we think museums and libraries can play a role in addressing. And how do we hook up, how do we link up with another organization to make a difference? So just a couple of these other projects. We've worked with the First Lady, Michelle Obama, who you've probably heard has a big campaign against, about preventing childhood obesity. So our agency worked with 7 different museum associations and the First Lady's office to create Let's Move Museums and Gardens. And if you go to the IMLS website, you'll see that almost 600 museums and gardens have designed programs, activities, even changed the food that they offer based on some commitments they're making to successful health and nutrition. And the good thing about it is that we're collecting all of these ideas and activities, and people are learning from each other. And it's also feeding back into non-museum and library sort of knowledge and insights about, oh, you know, our children's museum or our conservatory can really help us in creating environmentally sensitive plants and environments. So there is, unfortunately, around all of our different industries or areas, these silos that exist as we become more and more specialized. And I think, and my point to you is that we've got to go beyond, we've got to bust through some of those silos, whether they're disciplinary silos or whether they're the kinds of norms that we each have in terms of our museums or our libraries, and think about ways we can work together. And I think that technology is playing a big part in that, as is research on learning. So my last project before I left IMLS was something called Growing Young Minds, it's right here. We did this with the Annie E. Casey Foundation and something called the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, because recent research about the brain and learning shows that if you don't really turn a corner with children before they're 8 years old, and it's really a lot earlier than that, that child will have a terrible, terrible time catching up. And there are all sorts of dire statistics if you're not reading by grade level at age 3. So Sandra mentioned, you know, my passion about learning and my passion about museums and libraries. And this chart comes from a study that the National Research Council did called Learning Science in Informal Environments. And I love this chart because what this chart talks about, if you look at the orange part, though that is the time in our life that we're in a classroom. And you see the blue part? That's all the time in our lives that we're not in a classroom, but we're learning, and we can learn. So when I think about this chart, and when I think about what we are learning about what is effective learning, and then when I think about what museums have to offer, it becomes very, very exciting to me. So this is the first map that I wanted to show you. This is a map called The Future of Learning. And here it is it's really not a map, it's an infographic. So please don't, if anybody is here from the geography department, you know, my son is a geographer and he would be cringing at this point, but I'm loosely using the term. But it's an infographic that comes out of this report by KnowledgeWorks, which is a nonprofit based in Cincinnati, Ohio, that works with futurists and teachers and grant makers in education and learners to think about how is society changing and what is that going to mean in terms of visioning and envisioning our learning today and tomorrow. So what you see in this infographic is actually defined if you go to their website. There are specific examples and URLs for every single idea that's up there. So this is not about some future that's over the hill. This is about what's happening now, including what's happening in our museums. So if we just kind of go around here, and I'd love to then get some reaction from you as you think about this, whether, because one of the things I'm hoping for is that if you really think some of these ideas are ridiculous and museums have no role to play in any of them, I'd love to have a little bit of a conversation about that. But if you start up at maybe 11 o'clock there, you see the first thing that it says up there is that school will take many forms. Sometimes it will be self-organized. And this whole infographic is about envisioning something called a new ecosystem for learning. That goes with what I was saying about my partnerships. We're all connected. And in a world where technology is connecting us, we're connected even more than ever. So one of the premises is that we all need to think about putting a learner at the center, thinking about the needs of the learner, and not just thinking about the needs of the learner, but thinking about how learners today are behaving. I don't know, any of your students, do you see yourself in this at all as you're going around? Do you define your own learning? Do you have your own learning playlist? Where do you get your resources for your learning? From textbooks? From anybody ever use Wikipedia or ever use Google? Okay, we have a naysayer about Wikipedia up here. Do I hear anybody for Wikipedia? Yeah. I know Darlene and I and Josephine and I just had a snack together, and I think, was it this one? That's the one. Darlene was saying, oh, this is my son, my 12-year-old son. So, there's an average 12-year-old. Just on road from middle school, so what this is, and this is not necessarily a prescription for utopia, because what KnowledgeWorks says is what these trends, which are all really happening, could lead to is, in best case scenario, what they call a vibrant learning grid. In other words, where each child, each adult is able to find something and connect to something in the system that fuels his or her own personal passions and his or her own lifelong learning. Sometimes using resources online, sometimes using resources in a museum. And I just wanted, for those of you who probably can't read this, that little blue building up there and this yellow building up there, it says the word museum is there. So it's not like museums are not part of this ecosystem. But this notion of learning unbundled from any one type of institution, this notion of just as you probably have your own playlist for the songs that you want to play on your iPod or whatever your listening device is, you can, and many people are doing that for their learning. So unbundling of school as we know it, radical personalization as the norm, a change in the role of the teacher. Because as someone, John Seely Brown, anybody know John Seely Brown? Okay, he created Xerox's Research Park. So he's kind of this interesting, and he always has titles like Director of Curiosity. You know, wouldn't you want to have one of those jobs? But he talks about moving from stocks of knowledge, in other words, fixed content, to flows of knowledge. Because in the world that we're in, given the fact that any of you on your iPhones has access to more information than are in, how many encyclopedias, and it's always changing, right? The information. That the pressures and trends and credits of this world are really not going to be, if you mastered a whole body of knowledge, that knowledge is going to have a limited shelf life because new knowledge is being created all the time. I work now for the Noyce Foundation, N-O-Y-C-E, and Bob Noyce, he invented the semiconductor with Gordon Moore, and they started Intel. And he died several years ago, but his wife started this foundation. And again, one of the premises of that whole industry is about the changing access to knowledge and literally the changing definition of knowledge. So what this ecosystem is talking about is unbundling of school, the radical personalization of learning, the fact that educators' jobs will require many other skills. And I would say that goes for curators' jobs. I would say it goes for professors' jobs, that you can't just have a fixed syllabus and necessarily have it relate to or respond to the changes in the world or the needs of your students. A wide variety of digital networks, platforms, and content resources will help learners and learning agents connect and learn. Geographical and virtual communities will take ownership of learning in different ways. And then this is another one that's really interesting about credentialing. What was that phrase you used, Darlene?
A mixed transcript.
A mixed transcript. So what's happening now is, have any of you heard about badging? Okay, so there are a number of industries and there are a number of museums also who are coming up with digital badges. So, you can think about Girl Scout badges. Was anybody a Girl Scout? Okay. So instead of learning how to make a campfire, you may be learning some aspect of digital media production. And that might be credentialed via some sort of digital badge that you can carry with you in and out of the classroom, in and out of the workplace. And there's a big investment now in badging activities, including at the Department of Education, the Department of Veterans Affairs, in several museums that I know of that are working with badging. So it's basically saying that the world of learning as we know it is getting upended, spun around, and we don't know how it's going to end up yet. So as I said, the optimum hope is that we have this vibrant learning grid where each of us gets to be at the center and find the pathways to the learning that works for us, and find the pathways to the skills that we need for our different jobs. The opposite, which could very well happen, is an increasingly fragmented learning ecosystem, a learning system that keeps getting more and more unequal. And you've all heard of the digital divide, and if people don't know about or have access to, say, museum programs, or they don't really know how to use the resources in a library, we can create more inequality, and we can create more uncoordination, which would be really sad because it doesn't have to be that way, but it calls for a change in our mindsets about how our individual institutions need to create different relationships with each other. And that can happen within any sort of microsystem. It can happen in a campus, it can happen in a city, and it can happen across venues. What do you think about something like this? Anybody want to challenge, raise a question? Yeah.
Look, I just wanted to introduce something, and you used a word before that sort of plays with me every day, the word curiosity.
Yeah.
And I think that fundamental to this is that if it's going to operate, if it's actually going to work, that level of individual curiosity has to be rewarded, has to be encouraged, has to find a place to follow all of those paths. If you don't have the curiosity, this thing will fall apart.
That's right.
Because it relies on the individual, then not
Right.
just being there as a taker, I consume information as opposed to I'm actively involved with creating the knowledge that I have as opposed to being told what to. So all of these things that start at a very early age. Obviously museums can, I had similar experience when I was 7 at MoMA with my mother in front of a Rothko. So I mean, I know what brought me into the museums early. What I'm trying to say is that if we seem to have more and more things, and sometimes technology is part of it, that doesn't engender the kind of curiosity that we used to, well, what we had when we didn't have access to Wikipedia and Google. I mean, Google sometimes seems like, oh, well, it has all the answers, so I don't have to worry, I can find it if I want it. But I don't have to look for it. I don't really have to pursue it. I don't have to be involved. And curiosity requires some commitment of the person. And where does that come into play, and how do we actualize that so that there is this new public that can fit into this model very well? Because it seems to me it's being depressed more than it is being encouraged. And some of the education guidelines today, where you have to teach to the test, you have to teach to this, you have to do this, it's foreign to that. It really, you have, if I have something curious, we don't have time for that. We have to teach to that.
Right.
We can't respond to something that is, and I find us working against this model in many ways. Even though I really like the model, I find us working against it.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. That's great. Anybody want to, stay tuned for my next slide.
That makes a great point, and I'm just looking at this from the perspective of a student who's about to graduate, and the circle that I can't stop looking at is the red one at 9 o'clock. Work will evolve so rapidly that continuous career readiness will become the norm. And I think about, there may not be reward for curiosity necessarily, but the reason for doing it may be the threat of losing your position. It's what we talk about all the time in the classroom, that technology is moving so fast that if you don't keep up with it, you're not going to have a job. And we're talking about, I'm going to graduate this year, and I'm going to be taking the job of somebody that was just hired 4 years ago, because that's how fast technology is evolving. And that's neat, but the scary thing is that the person that graduates in 2 years might be taking my job, and might not keep up with it. So my incentive for staying curious is to continually evolve with the whole process of it.
Well, and you're very much, so I think exactly what you're saying. Our society, and one of the things No Child Left Behind did, but it didn't start with No Child Left Behind, is value that sort of those cognitive skills more than anything else, and that acquisition of knowledge. So, as we say, the sage on the stage, you drank in that knowledge, and then you felt that you had mastered it. But we're in a world where exactly what you're saying, curiosity, imagination, pushing the boundaries of what we know and creating new things is where it's at. Exactly. So I would argue that that is a perfect role that museums have played through time, because we don't have that set curriculum. But it does mean that we need to think about how we do what we do. One of the projects that I was involved with, and maybe I'll just go to the next slide, because this is a model of learning that I don't know, curiosity. You probably can't read all this. Let's see, cross-generational share. Okay, so one of the other projects I worked on at IMLS was something called. It was a project with the MacArthur Foundation, and we funded 24 learning laboratories for teens in libraries and museums around the country, and including the Da Vinci Science Center in Allentown, working with the Allentown Public Library. And this was for our work at IMLS, we did this because we'd done a lot of work on 21st century skills. They, again, creativity, imagination, the self-directed learning that can take place in a museum or library setting, the importance of critical thinking. And I have to look at Sandra, that was kind of a core of what we were all about when I was at NEH with Sandra. The importance of being able to analyze trusted material and assess it, and then to communicate about it. And of course, now you're not just communicating in words and writing, but you're communicating online in different ways. So that curiosity to me has always been core to what museums do. And what I think this world is calling for is putting museums out there in a much more visible way as centers for curiosity. So with the learning labs that we funded, the learning labs are places for kids they're for teens. So they're really focused on one organization, one group. And they're places for teens to hang out, mess around, or geek out. And the research that is based, that this is all based on, is research that's been done by people like John Seeley Brown, an anthropologist named Mimi Ito, who's at the University of California, and Henry Jenkins, who was at MIT for many years. And all three of them have written about kind of participatory culture and the fact that people need to have a way in to learn, and that there is as important to using your mind is understanding the social emotional basis of learning, which is where this hanging out thing comes. So what all of this research is evolving into is this notion of connected learning, which is driven by interests. And so I would say the premise is that we all are curious. Nobody is born uncurious. But some of us are in environments where we don't have the opportunity to have that curiosity valued or to have that curiosity nurtured. Our parents don't necessarily let us play. Play is a big part of this, a huge part of this. We're not able to just play or explore. And I was saddened a few weeks ago when my assistant, who has a couple of nieces and nephews down in North Carolina, she said that her brother and sister-in-law are so into their jobs that they don't want their children ever to make a mess, which includes baking cupcakes or, coloring spaghetti, or, they want to buy their Halloween costumes at the store. They just don't want anything messy. And Allison's mother, who is a former teacher, is the one who provides those opportunities for messiness and play and creativity for her grandchildren. Because for Allison's brother and sister-in-law, they really don't have time, and they don't really understand the value of play. So in these learning labs that we have funded, there's room for play. There's room for hanging out. There's room for another big trend that you may have heard about, which is maker. Anybody's heard of the Maker Fair or Maker? So I won't get...
You're in Scranton.
There are a lot of makers here. I bet you, if you scratch the surface, you'll find some maker groups.
The university has a 3D printer.
There you go. And in fact, I just read that there is the Science Museum of London. I don't think it's the Natural History Museum, it's the Science Museum of London, is just mounting its first exhibit of only 3D printed art. And some of it's portraits. So anyway, have you all heard about a 3D printer? Okay, all right. Have any of you used it? All right. So I actually saw someone make pancakes using one at the New York Hall of Science. And I just read a story about someone who invited a 3D printing guru to his house, and they did a whole menu using 3D printers. Anyway, it's changing the world. There was a Smithsonian Magazine article not too long ago about a 3D printer making a human ear. Anybody see that? So what the maker aesthetic taps into is that people like to use their hands. Have any of you heard of Etsy? All right, so Etsy taps into that maker aesthetic. So that urge that people want to get together and make things, and the fact that now that we have the internet, you don't necessarily have to invent your new bottle of water, find a company like Dasani to manufacture your water, because you can go online and you can connect to somebody else who's going to make your water for you. So Chris Anderson from Wired magazine has written a whole book calling Maker the Third Industrial Revolution. Well, our museums tend to be about things, right? So I have seen, actually, and I saw a big project from the Parsons School of Design where the art students there using 3D printing are really looking at issues of climate change and cloud formation and weather, but creating 3D printed works of art, sculptures, based on their knowledge of science. So I would say, and I know of several museums now that have shut down an exhibit or two and have created these maker spaces where people can come in, and with the expertise of people at the museum, curator or educator, indulge in their own creativity. So I was just telling Josephine and Darlene, I was at the Denver Museum of Art in July, and they have, throughout the museum, they have an exhibit, a whole series of exhibits called Spun. And Spun is getting out there all their different textile collections. But in addition to seeing Navajo textiles and seeing some of their 17th and 18th century samplers and quilts, you can have a space right there in the gallery where you can do your own quilting, where you can feel those quilts, where you can, now you can't necessarily touch the 17th century quilt, but you can feel what it might have felt like. And you can try your hand at some of those activities. And I think that sort of moving forward in terms of participatory learning, so we're using one sense, our eyes, but we're also using our hands, maybe we're using other senses too. We're touching, we're smelling, we're hearing. That is moving into our museum world, and it's creating some powerful spaces for this type of learning that's based on social relationships, that builds on the interests that youth naturally have, but might seem, if I'm interested in hip hop, that might not seem really connected to my course in Shakespeare. But if I get interested in hip hop and poetry, that might spark an interest in language for me that's a little different. So this model, which is it's very much a prototype model, it's really based on this notion of bringing different groups together around learning, mentoring from peers, having peers mentor each other, because teens do that, but also bringing adults in who may or may not be in the academy. They may be in a museum or library. So connecting that interest-driven learning to academic learning around a shared purpose, and again around this notion of producing something. And it's not that this eschews any notion of quality or connoisseurship, because I've talked to many teens who've been involved with this, and they want to get better. And the coaches and the people and the mentors who work with them are constantly challenging them to improve. So it's not like our expertise as museum professionals or professors gets thrown out of the window, but our relationship with the learners changes. And sometimes I can tell you that I have a couple of relationships with much, much younger museum professionals who are reverse mentoring me. So sometimes the mentorship gets flipped, and that's okay. And again, it helps to value and nurture what we need today, which is that curiosity, imagination, creativity, flexibility. Yes, Sandra?
So is the education that you got, let's say in art history, or that I got in philosophy, is there any room for that in this scenario?
Well, this has taken me back to my education, and one of the things that was always interesting to me is, even when I was at the University of Michigan in the very first class of the residential college, and a lot of these principles were governed then. So the professors lived close by, we had classes with full professors, we had multidisciplinary classes, we had pass-fail in those days. So I don't think it's disconnected. I think what's changed is the speed at which knowledge is being created. I mean, I think, and the piece I didn't talk about, I don't know if it's even here on this particular slide, is this notion of big data. So even in the arts and the humanities and the sciences, what technology is allowing us to do is collect information, whether it's bringing together digitized images of all Chinese Sung pottery, in 100 museums around the world. Well, that would change, I think, how I studied art history, because Gabe Weisberg, my professor, he had his own 25 slides on Sung Dynasty pottery. And we better memorize every single one of those, right? Well, now, either online or because of museums digitizing their collections and making them available because of what we can find when we go to the library, we can see so many more of these images, and then we can combine and recombine sets of knowledge in ways that I don't think we were able to before. So there's amazing work being done with humanities texts so that you can look at, 19th century literature and you can find all of this stuff about phrases or words or images that is just helping create a whole new generation of scholars. So I don't know if I'm answering you. It's sort of yes and. And again, some of my teachers are still my teachers from way back in those days. The ones that are still alive I still stay in touch with. So and those of you here at the university, maybe you can, have your classes changed? Are you doing things in some different ways? Are you experiencing this? Are you experiencing any of this? Anybody? Yeah.
I hate to
No, go ahead.
Yeah, but one of the things that, I don't know if it's changed so much, I keep thinking about it and try to rethink it. I haven't taught all that much, I teach periodically, and now I'm teaching again this semester. What I always say to students at the beginning, because I'm one who doesn't feel comfortable with, or think it's actually all that valued, the old banking system that you have a sense of how much knowledge they're supposed to know, and they have to be able to know that by the end of class, and you're going to test them to see if they know it. I always say to them that it's not about what you remember. I'm not even all that interested in your memory. I said, but I'm interested in how you think. And there are ways to promote that as a continuing process.
Exactly.
So I say to them, the way we know we've succeeded is if at the end of class you can ask new questions that you never could have asked at the beginning of class. It's not the answers you think I want at the end of class that is going to mean we succeeded. It's how you can form new questions. So that's an ongoing process, as opposed to a finite process that says it's about a limited amount of stuff that I can give you. That's the banking concept.
Exactly.
I find that, though, it's still to be pretty prevalent, that most people still teach based on that. Most testing is based on that. I went through it myself, but I teach it the other way because I know it didn't work.
Right.
I mean, I said, I said, I don't have to ask you to remember something. I said, because if I ask you to remember everything, it isn't going to work, and you won't remember most of it later, but you're going to remember what you liked or what mattered to you. I said, so build on that while we're in class.
Exactly.
And then that's where you question, and then you can additives, you can put other stuff in later, but it's that part of the process that troubles me, that I don't see it, and I see it working against it. That's what I was saying before, that the education system is not, as we teach more to the test, as we require tests, as we require, you have to show this is working because they passed this test in this manner and they passed. It isn't conducive to, the Danish system is similar to what you were saying in college for their, what they call the folk schools. And those are ones where they don't give tests. They never give tests. They never do anything like that. And I said, well, how do you know when you're at the end? They said, well, at the end, there's sort of an evaluation at the time to go on to college, but they don't work towards all these tests all the time. So it's always experimental. It's always thinking. They're developing new projects. They're constantly, this kind of Finland does similar things and other places that we don't seem to get it here.
No, you're right. This is definitely swimming against the stream.
All of these sound great, but I'm afraid that as much as I'd love to see these all operational, I keep seeing this somebody out there is fighting against your model.
Oh yeah, and it's not my model, but it's interesting. But it is interesting because even the Common Core standards, which are the new standards, which try to get a little more like this. I don't know if you've. I used to. I don't know if that I will anymore. But I used to read all the guidelines for the program, for the grant programs at the Department of Education, which are emphasizing things like personalized learning environments and interest-driven learning. But if you are an instructor who doesn't really understand how that works and wants to cling to the old way and the old tests, you can see the resistance to something even like Common Core, which is really designed to promote critical thinking and imagination and cross-disciplinary thinking. And what's coming up next is the next generation science standards, which are about the scientific process and the scientific method, not about studying rocks in the 2nd grade and dinosaurs in the 4th grade and, water in the 6th grade. And there's tremendous angst in the education establishment about, the teacher burnout and turnover, and now I'm talking about K-12, but also to the fact that this is not going to be familiar or easy for most teachers. I mean, in most elementary schools, they don't even have a science teacher, for example. Yeah.
It's interesting you talk about the resistance that's probably going to come from the teachers, but it's going to come from the students as well. I actually read an essay last year about an Ivy League student, who's a great student, and they went to a Scandinavian country for a semester, and they ran into the same thing you were talking about, where they don't have the same standards and testing systems that he's been used to his entire life, and he came unraveled. He couldn't handle it. How do I know what I'm learning? How do I know if I'm succeeding? And I just looked at him like he was crazy and said, you just learn. That's the problem.
Well, yeah, and I've read a lot about you know, high school students and applying for college today, and the pressures and stress that's being felt throughout.
I just heard, maybe others have, I've read it, someone told me about it, I didn't read it. Bard has thrown out the SATs.
Oh, it was in the New York Times Sunday, yeah.
Yeah, that the criteria for entrance will be 4 essays.
Yeah, there are kind of research questions in 4 different disciplinary areas.
It's a great idea.
So yeah, we're not talking about something that's mainstream. We're not talking about something that's yet mainstream.
But at least out there.
Yeah.
I know my mother works at a school where they just had to institute the Common Core curriculum, and it's definitely a struggle, like you said, for the older teachers who don't want to go that way. It's definitely a great experience for the students because my mother's a reading teacher and she finds herself teaching a lot of art and a lot of science along with it, and they're trying to bring in current events and give the full picture.
Right.
But the problem she's having with it is they're trying to get so in depth with the greater picture, which is really wonderful, and the students are responding well, but at the same time there's still county standardized tests that are saying, well, you still need to devote this much time to us, so we have to cut into your time for the arts and the other things you're bringing in. So it's definitely a struggle, not just from students and teachers, but also from some other standards who are still trying to make you do multiple choice.
I was at a meeting last summer in Idaho with the Council of Chief State School Officers, and several of them were pleading. The meeting had mostly not, this particular session had a lot of business people and people involved in various civic capacities in communities. And what the school superintendents were begging us in the audience to do was to help message this so that when the first sets of scores come in that are probably not going to be so good, that you wouldn't immediately say off with the superintendent's head or let's fire all the teachers, whatever. And in the state of Maryland, I do think that they're trying to come up with some space before they're going to be using so that the tests can catch up to the Common Core. But it's, again, we're in a period of real churn here. And that, for me, is one of the reasons why I've always loved being outside the school system, in the informal or non-formal learning sector. We are doing this, and we can do it without quite as much attention. That often means we don't get as much money, which is another issue, but we can do it, yeah.
2 questions. Do you know any museums that are particularly ahead of the curve that you could talk about? And do these museums or others who are eager to learn have any collaborative relationships with schools?
Yes. I mean, the most recently I've been involved with science museums, but I used to be the director of Conner Prairie, which is a living history museum outside of Indianapolis, so I'm going to start with Conner Prairie since I left there a long time ago. But they have a multi-institutional grant from the National Science Foundation called Science on the Prairie. So Conner Prairie is about 1836 Indiana, and it's mostly a social history place with costumed interpreters. But what Ellen Rosenthal, the director, realized is that, in fact, when you talk about agriculture or carpentry or weaving or all of these things that happened then and are happening now, there's some science lessons in all of this. So she's actually linked up with I think she's with the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry and the New York Hall of Science. And what they're doing is developing programs, but all of it is key to curriculum. In fact, I don't know that I could name a museum now that is not doing, that has not created curricular materials. Now, based on, of course, they based them on No Child Left Behind, right? So I do know, especially in California, a number of museums, especially I think in Orange County, are working on, they've redone their standards. The Huntington Museum and Gardens in San Marino is another one, to align with the Common Core. So I think that's been the norm. I think some museum people get very frustrated, just as you're frustrated, because it's like, we've got enough on our plate. What do we have to worry about those schools for? They keep changing the bar. But in most cases, museums, I think, are working closely together. There's an interesting project that's also a national project that comes out of the Children's Museum of Houston, which has, which is kind of almost like the Science Museum in Houston. Have you been there, Josephine? So it's a fabulous museum, and they've worked with MIT and Sesame Street and they've got amazing partners, including Rice University, I think they work with, and some other universities. So they do a lot of very, very interesting things. They have a library branch in the museum, and they have some programs that have gone national around family literacy. But one of the things that they've developed is they realize that, they have curatorial expertise. And the way they've applied their curatorial expertise recently is looking at apps on iPads. And there are hundreds of thousands of apps. So they looked at all of the experiences that they have pertaining to science and math in their museum. And they had their curators and their educators pick out apps that were were solid and had good content and were engaging and imaginative, and linked directly to some of the phenomena and scientific processes that they're trying to talk about. So as their interpreters and educators, and I think they, like many science museums, have teen explainers, they go around the floor and you're looking at something or other. Maybe it's something on aerodynamic design. There's a thing about flying a plane. They can give you right away, they can point you to some apps that you can use at home to take that learning home. And they've created this now as a site for many, many different museums. So they're using their expertise and knowledge, but maybe it's not only on an in-museum experience. It's how do we take what happens inside the museum and transfer it to a mobile platform so that the families, the parents can take it, the kids themselves can take it home. I don't know if that answers your question, but I see that happening all the time. And what I don't see happening as much is for museums to share this among themselves. So there's, I feel like there's a lot more room for that. And so that combination of inventing a new thing but then sharing it out so that you can adapt it to your own community in new ways I think we could do a lot more of that.
So do you work with the AAM
Oh yeah.
to do that? Because
Yeah.
that's obviously the vehicle to share that.
Yeah, they do some of that. They tend to, some of that is shared at some of the conferences and professional conferences and on listservs. It doesn't always get down to the real mechanics of, what is the secret sauce of that thing. And museums, unfortunately, often don't even collaborate very well with other museums. As someone once told me, and she's someone from Pennsylvania actually, she once told me, museums are really great at the oral tradition, but we don't read very much, museum people. So we don't, even when you publish these case studies, people don't read them. So let's see, I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but I wanted to end with another study that was just done and published at the end of, I think it was published last October, or maybe it might have come out even this spring, and it was something done by the Kress Foundation, and the Kress Foundation's in New York, and museums, etc., just published this book. So Max Marmer, who runs the Kress collection, is very interested in the role of the campus art museum. Because he's done a lot of, he I guess did some study and found out that even as universities get accredited, the museum isn't always even part of the accreditation. You know, people don't even recognize the museum as a valuable resource. So he worked with a researcher, and this was a qualitative study. And she sifted through a whole lot of data and information and did a lot of interviews and came up with 7 exemplary art museums. And we won't get into it. The book talks, and if you go online, you'll see exactly how they were selected. And the museums were Indiana University Art Museum, the Spencer Museum of Art at the University of Kansas, the University of Missouri Museum of Art and Archaeology, the Snite Museum of Art at Notre Dame, the Allen Memorial Art Museum at Oberlin, the David and Allen Smart Museum, Alfred Smart Museum at University of Chicago, and the University of Arizona Museum of Art. And I, you know, what I found was kind of map-like, again, suspend your disbelief, okay? Was a whole series of metaphors that the interviewees used when they described their campus art museum. And I just thought it would be interesting to kind of end with this, because here we are in a campus art museum. I don't know what associations you in this room or what your colleagues would have of this museum. But and these are not mutually exclusive categories. I mean, these are just things that people refer to in the interviews. And students were interviewed, faculty members, trustees, administrators, community members. So some people talked about the museum as a gem, you know, a jewel. Unfortunately, in a few cases, a hidden gem, which is not so great, right? The nursery, I'm going to go counterclockwise. The nursery is not that, it doesn't refer to age of people, but as in a garden, a place where seeds are planted, and a place that kind of nurtures and nourishes new ideas and growth, student growth and faculty growth. The heart of the campus, and this, I think this came originally from the Indiana Museum of Art, which actually is in the physical center of the campus. And I think last year they had a whole year called the Year of the Museum at Indiana University, where literally the museum was the center for a whole set of cross-campus activities. Catalyst. So the catalyst ideas, you know, the museum as a place to get things started and energize people and get conversations going, not only about art, not only about art history, but about all manner of disciplines. And one of the things that Corinne, the author, links to Catalyst is narrative. The museum as storyteller, story collector, story maker. And then coming around, library, you know, the notion of library as a kind of storehouse of knowledge, both human knowledge and collections knowledge, thing knowledge, artifact knowledge. One of the last two I particularly liked, laboratory, you know, that, and several, and I don't know if this happens here, how different faculty from different departments use the gallery, and what classes come here. But in this study, there's wonderful examples of physics professors getting together with art historians, say, or math, and Josephine, I think, was just telling me about math and the visual arts. So this notion of a place of experimentation and exploration can be very powerful. And then lastly, portal. And again, the portal can be a portal up to the campus, but a portal also to the community. And we were just talking about the furnaces, and Darlene, you were just at the furnaces today, I guess, right?
This is just with Lisa, who is the site.
Oh, and we've met before, haven't we?
Yes.
I think I remember that. And so, you know, this whole notion of how the sort of town and gown come together and work together to enrich the learning for everybody is an important one. So there you've got it. Whoops, let's see. What's happening? So I don't know if anybody has that. I was just going to end with another, if I can find my ending here, with another John Seeley Brown quote, because, you know, I was just at an AAM sponsored meeting about 2 weeks ago in Washington, and we were talking about the future of learning and the future of museums, and everybody around the table until they came to me, was talking about the education industrial complex. And I mean, I was sitting at a table of cynics, that's all I can tell you. So when it came to me, I just said, all right, I'm a cockeyed optimist here. I want to think about what's possible because we want to do something. Otherwise, do we pack up our toys and just go home and close up shop? So when I came upon this quote from John Seeley Brown's Stanford University graduation address, it made me feel good. So he talks about what we are in, John Seeley Brown, we are in a Cambrian moment. Does anybody know anything about geology? Okay. Do you want to tell us what the Cambrian moment is? Okay. Well, the Cambrian moment was a time when it was an evolutionary period of unbelievable explosion of biodiversity. It was just like there were only a limited number of species and then there was poof. So John Seeley Brown says we are in a Cambrian moment, a moment of explosion of evolutionary progress, a time when classical boundaries are being blurred, boundaries between the virtual and the real, between teaching and learning, between cognition and emotion. And he says, to me, what makes this particular moment so special is this feeling of being in a moment of great change and great possibility, one that requires regrinding the conceptual lenses through which we make sense of this increasingly connected world. So I would hope that you'd feel a sense of that potential and possibility, and that you'd keep following. I can't remember your first name, I'm Bob. That we'd all take Bob's advice and realize the importance of nurturing curiosity and imagination and invention, and recognize and celebrate the fact that our museums are places that can happen. So thank you very much. Oh, did you want to ask?
Small thought, but
sure.
a long time ago I took a course at the California School of Fine Arts in drawing and color, and I still remember the lesson I learned when the professor went around and looked at what we had drawn. He said, "Don't look at what you've drawn. Look at what you're going to draw, and just draw it as you look at it," so that the reality came through. It was just a good moment for me.
That's fantastic, and you remember it.
I remember it, and I don't draw much anymore, but that's the lesson.
Well, I think he was saying something about what you see and how you
What
see.
you see,
Yeah.
and how you respond.
That's fantastic, thank you. And I want to thank Sandra and Darlene for inviting me here, and thank you all for coming. So thank you so much. So is this the time when everybody eats, or do you want to ask more questions or have more conversation?
Why don't you help yourself, and Marsha will be around talking.
I will be here. And I brought I have copies of some of this stuff if anybody's interested. I brought- My son digitizes maps.
We won't talk to some of us.